This video will show you how to complete the Individual Identification Information Record in Fintracker. Completing this form is an important step in fulfilling your requirements under the PCML-TFA. Under this act, you are required to verify the identities of all parties that you are representing in the transaction. This could be your client, it could be any parties that are contributing funds to the deal, or it could be a self-represented party. The Individual Identification Information Record is your method of verifying your client's identity. You are required to complete the individual ID record before writing any offer if you're the buyer's agent, or before writing any listing if you're the seller's agent. And you should also complete it before you complete the receipt of funds record. Doing so ensures consistency and accuracy between your Fintrack paperwork and your offer paperwork, and it makes sure that your individual ID record matches your agreement of purchase and sale. That being said, you can verify your client's identity even earlier, and you should be talking to them about Fintrack as early as possible in the process. For example, some agents even choose to use the individual identification record as a means of pre-screening before they meet their clients for a showing. That way they know exactly who they're meeting up with. It's a sort of extra safety precaution. Now that's up to you, but as long as you do it before writing the offer or before writing the listing. Now that we've discussed the purpose and the timing of the individual identification information record, let's go through an example of how to complete it. Okay, today we will be verifying the identity of our client, Ron McDonald. Ron is a Canadian citizen, but he has been living and working in Florida for the past 5 years. He is a teacher at the FSBA, that's the Florida School Board Association, and he's coming back to Toronto to support his aging parents. So he's looking for a property in the Toronto area. So we will be representing him as the buyer's agent. With that in mind, let's look at how we would fill out the individual identification information record. From your Fintracker homepage, which should be your My Records page, click on the plus sign in the top right-hand corner of the screen if you're on desktop. If you're working on a mobile device, it will be at the bottom right of the screen. Then, from the drop-down menu, select New Individual Identification. The first two options that you'll see are the Search Previous Records field and the Select from Remote ID Verifications field. It's important to note that you don't have to go through the ID verification process each time you write an offer for a client. You can verify their identity at the beginning of your relationship, and then as long as their information stays current, you can just import their information via Search Previous each time that you're completing a new record. So for example, if I search Ron, you'll see that I do have a previous record with him. I can just select his information and it will populate the applicable fields in this record. Similarly, if I had requested Ron to do a remote ID verification, this is where I could import it into this record. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to fill out the entire form together from scratch. So you'll see that your name and brokerage will pre-populate based on your settings in Fintracker. You'll need to indicate if you're completing this record for a buyer client or a seller client. In this case, we're working with a buyer. Then you'll have the option of sending a Fintrack disclosure email to your client to explain what Fintracker is and explain why you are requesting that they share this information with you. Again, this is an optional step, but it can be helpful to explain to clients why you're requesting their personal information, as some clients might be resistant to providing their ID. To send it, simply enter the client's email and then click Send Fintrack Disclosure. They will receive this email from Fintracker that has your name and a link to the PDF that explains what Fintrack is. But please don't just rely on this email. You also need to have conversations with your clients early in the process and prepare them that you're going to be requesting this information from them. You can simply explain that you're writing a legal contract and you're going to need their full legal name and a record of their ID. The last thing you want is for them to be caught off guard when you send them a request to share their ID, as this could make them feel defensive or concerned. Next, you'll have the option to add your record to a transaction kit. Now, remember that you can ID a client before you even have a transaction with them. And as mentioned, the best practice is to ID your client early in the process. And it must be done absolutely before you write the offer. But good news, you just have to do it once, and then you can use Search Previous to retrieve the record and add it to a new transaction kit for each offer that you do. So really at this stage, you might not have a transaction and you could leave this blank and just save the record until you know the property that you're going to be placing the offer on. But in this example, we're going to pretend that we're about to write the offer and we know what property we're going to use. So to do so, we're going to click in the transaction property address field. Then enter the full address, including the street address, the city, the province, and the postal code. And remember, this is the address of the property that you're putting in the offer for, or the property that you're listing if you're the listing agent. Make sure that you enter the address correctly, as this is the address that's going to auto-populate all of the records in your transaction kit. Once you're ready, click Set. Now let's get into the verification stage. Section A is all about verifying the identity of your client, which is an important component of knowing your client under Fintrack. You'll see that there are 3 methods of verification that you can use to verify your client's identity. A1 is the photo ID method, which is the preferred method. Method A2 and A3 are to be used when your client does not have a photo ID, but again, we strongly recommend avoiding these methods wherever possible. It's very rare that you will be representing a client who does not have an ID, and photo ID verification is always the preferred method. So we're not going to be discussing methods A2 and A3 in this video. We do have separate video resources available specifically on these sections, but we're just not going to talk about it here. Let's start with A1, the photo ID method. This is the method that you're going to be using for 95% of your transactions. And to do so, you're required to use the app on your mobile device to scan your client's ID. Here's what it looks like to scan an ID in the app. From the My Records page in the app, click on the plus sign in the bottom corner and select New Individual Identification. Once in the individual ID record, you'll see a big Scan Photo ID button at the bottom of the screen. Click it. The system will show you what documents can be scanned. Click Continue. Then position the camera in front of the ID's barcode. The app will read the barcode and autofill the applicable fields in the record for you. You can see that the A1 section is now filled out for you. The system will autofill the client's name, their address, date of birth. It pulls everything directly from their ID, and it also pulls information about the ID itself, including the document number, expiry date, etc. And this eliminates the risk of any manual errors from you inputting the information manually. It's super quick and easy and accurate. You're probably going to be using an Ontario driver's license. But as you can see from our example, you can use an ID from a foreign country as well, as long as it is a valid current ID. You cannot use an expired ID as a source of verification. Next, occupation. Now the occupation section is very important, and this is a spot where we see a lot of errors. You need to be very specific in this section, avoid acronyms, and if something doesn't make sense in regards to the transaction, you need to request more information from the client. For example, our client is a teacher, so I'm going to enter teacher as the occupation. If someone is retired, unemployed, or self-employed, you can't simply write that. That's not enough information. You need to elaborate by writing retired, former teacher, or self-employed, owner of a private school, something like that. And let's just talk a little bit more about self-employed individuals. If they are self-employed, then you need to write the name of their business in the employer field or put a link to their website. For example, if they're a writer, put the link to their writer's website. If they're a photographer, put the link to their photography website. Remember, the goal is to provide information that is auditable and explains the source of funds. Now let's go back to our example. For employer, you need to enter the employer's full name. Don't use any acronyms. Write out the name. For example, our client works for the FSBA. But I can't write that. I need to write Florida School Board Association. And finally, industry, I'm going to write public education. So just to recap, because this is really important, in this section you must be specific, avoid acronyms, and make sure that everything makes sense. For example, if someone is unemployed and the only name on title is theirs, that doesn't add up. Where are their funds coming from? Your goal is to include information that explains where this person's getting their funds and recording it in a way that it can be verified. Moving on to section B, here you'll need to indicate if there's a third party involved in the transaction or not. If the answer is no, then you can just click no and continue on. If there is a third party involved, then you should click yes, and then you need to complete the third party record in section B2. In B2, you'll select if the third party is an individual, so if that's another person or persons contributing funds to this deal, or a corporation. So for example, if the person on title owns a company and that company is contributing funds, then that would be a corporation. And again, to complete this section, you'll need to scan the third party's ID, and you'll also need to enter specific verifiable information about their occupation, just like you did in section 1. But in this example, we're going to assume there is no third party, so I'm going to select no. Now in section C, you're going to answer some questions to obtain a risk score for your client. This is going to give you an indication of whether or not this is a safe client to proceed with, or if additional measures are required. These questions are fairly straightforward yes or no questions, but let's take a quick look. So question 1, prior to this transaction, did you previously work with this client or have a relationship with them? So no, this is our first time working with this client. To your knowledge, does this client have a criminal history? No. To your knowledge, is there a concern about money laundering, terrorist financing, and the location of the property? No. And again, obviously, if the answers were yes, you would click yes. Does the client live within 10 kilometers of an international border or 5 kilometers of an international airport? No, not our client. Is the client a Canadian citizen or permanent resident? Yes, our client is. Is the client a domestic PEP or the family member close associate of one? Now, PEP stands for politically exposed person, and that is someone who is entrusted with a prominent position that typically comes with the opportunity to influence decisions and the ability to control resources. So an example of a domestic PEP would be, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Governor General, a leader of a political party represented in a legislature, for example. So in this case, no, my client is not a PEP. Next, is the client a foreign PEP or HIO or a family member close associate of one? So again, PEP, politically exposed person. A foreign PEP would be, a president of a foreign country. A head of an international organization would be the leader of the International Olympics Committee or the CEO of the World Bank. So in this case, no, my client is not either of those. Okay, next, is the client subject to a ministerial directive? So what is a ministerial directive? Basically, it is a legally binding instruction from a Canadian minister, so generally the Minister of Finance, and it tells us that we have to automatically take enhanced measures for financial transactions with that affected country. And that means, if the person is a citizen of one of these countries under a directive, or if the funds are coming from one of these countries. And at present, there are 3 ministerial directives, so they would be with North Korea, Russia, and Iran. But obviously that list is subject to change, so you should always do a quick Google search and find out what the current ministerial directives are and if your client or the transaction is affected by it. In this case, no, our client is not subject to a ministerial directive. Okay, number 9, are you aware of any other connections to a high-risk country? So for example, Myanmar is an example of a country that doesn't have a ministerial directive, but it's still listed as a high-risk country. So in this case, no, our client's not affected. Has a client attempted to conceal their identity in any way? No, ours has not. Has your brokerage previously filed a suspicious transaction report or a terrorist property report on the client? No. Does the transaction seem unusual in light of the client's occupation? No. Does the transaction involve a third party? We've already stated that no, ours does not. Did you ID the client in a non-face-to-face setting? So no, we had our client physically with us. Did the client provide some or all of the deposit in cash? No, ours did not. Did the transaction seem unusual in light of the client's past transactions with the brokerage? Nope. Is there anything else about the client or the transaction? So in this case, no. If you did click yes, there is a box that appears where you can type in your answer. But if you do need to click it, then please be specific and clear in your explanation. But in this case, I'm going to click no. Okay, and once you've finished answering all those questions, click Save and Calculate, and the system will provide a risk score for the client. If you score anything above 10, or if you have reservations, please escalate the transaction to the compliance team immediately. Obviously, in this case, we have a low risk score, so we're okay to proceed. Now, in section D, you will record information about your business relationship with the client. D1 is very simple. You just need to select the checkbox that describes your business relationship with the client. For example, if your client is purchasing residential property, you would check this box. If they're buying an investment property that they're going to rent out, you select the second box. And commercial deals, you would either select the commercial property or land for commercial use. And a common mistake that we see here is that a realtor will help a client purchase several properties, but for each one, they've selected residential property. And this is incorrect. Residential property means that your client is buying the property to live in. If they're buying a property to rent out, to make income, then you must select the second checkbox, residential property for income purposes. So pay attention and select the appropriate box. In this case, our client is looking for a residential property. The next box is optional, where you can go into further detail about your business dealings. For example, if the client regularly purchases property for investment purposes, you could write that here, but it's not a mandatory field. Section D2 asks you what you will do to maintain your business relationship with the client and keep their information up to date. So in this section, we do often see mistakes because agents are listing what their relationship is instead of listing what they're going to do in order to maintain the relationship. For example, we often see agents select other, and then they write, the client is my sibling or I am the client. But this is not directly answering the question, because the question is, how are you going to maintain your relationship with this person? So no matter who the client is, you need to indicate the specific steps that you're going to take to keep the client info up to date. If you write, I am the client, it's going to be rejected. So for example, your measures that you're going to take, regardless of who the client is you're going to ask the client to provide identification each time they do a real estate transaction. So please pay attention here, as this is a common reason for rejected paperwork. Now, section D.2.3. You need to complete this if your client is a high-risk client, and this is based on the score that you obtained in section C, for example. You would complete this with your compliance officer because you need to escalate any high-risk clients to the compliance team, so they'll be able to guide you in this section. In general, for most clients, you won't need to complete this. D3 provides an important reminder that if you see something suspicious, you must report it to the compliance team. Remember, use what you learned in the anti-money laundering module about red flags and suspicious transactions, and always use your best judgment. Section E is a reminder to follow the brokerage procedures for terrorist property reports. So Zolo is required to report terrorist property to the RCMP, the CSIS, and to Fintrack. More information can be found in Zolo's Anti-Money Laundering and Anti-Terrorist Financing Policy and Procedures Manual. And finally, before you can finish, you need to provide some information related to politically exposed persons and heads of international organizations. Remember, a PEP, a politically exposed person, is someone who is entrusted with a prominent position that typically comes with the opportunity to influence decisions and the ability to control resources. So again, that could be like the Prime Minister of Canada. They could be domestic or they could be foreign. A head of an international organization is a person who holds the specific office or specific position of head of an international organization. So that would be the head of the IOC, the CEO of the World Bank. It's the specific person who is leading the organization. When completing an individual identification record, you need to declare PEP status and HIO status for both the person holding the title and also for any family member or close associates of the PEP. So if your client, for example, is married to the head of an international organization, you need to declare that. Or if they're a close associate, you need to declare that here. So you need to ask your client and also perform a search to determine if they are a PEP. Then you'd select the appropriate checkbox that corresponds with your client. So in our case, our client is not a PEP, so we're going to click none of the above. And then you'll need to indicate how you made the PEP determination. Did you ask the client? Did you do an internet search? Consult a PEP database or other? So in this case, we ask the individual and then select the date that the determination was made. Now, you'll notice that if you do check one of the boxes up here, so if our client was a politically exposed person, then you'll see a new section appears at the bottom. And here's where you need to enter the name of the position held by the PEP, as well as the name of their organization. Remember, you'll need to write out the full legal name of the person and write the full organization name. And you should always avoid acronyms. The individual is a client, obviously you would click yes. And then you need to list the source of the client's wealth. And then you would check the box to indicate that you've completed enhanced measures, which means letting your compliance team know, because for every deal associated with a PEP, you have to inform your compliance team. And then finally, check whether or not $100,000 in cash or virtual currency has been received from this individual. If you click yes, then you'll have to provide a bit more information. You have to indicate the source of the cash or virtual currency. For example, where is it coming from? Is it coming from their bank account? What type of account? The source of the individual's wealth, the name of the senior manager that has reviewed the transaction, because again, just want to stress that if there's a PEP involved or an HIO involved, it needs to go to the compliance team for review. And then finally, the date that the senior manager reviewed. And once you finish inputting the information, then you could save the record. At this stage, we're not going to be submitting the record because we still need to complete the receipt of funds and attach everything to a transaction kit. So we would just save it and it would go into My Records.